Washington Journal continues.
Congressman Peter Welch, the at-large congressman representing Virginia, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, Vermont.
Vermont. Did I say Virginia?
North.
Excuse me. My apologies. Huge difference. Vermont. Credit card rules for small businesses and consumers. You're having a meeting with Senator Dick Durbin tomorrow with the Fed chairman, Ben Bernanke, to talk about some of the implementation. Talk to us about your meeting.
Well, what this is about is the rulemaking process by which we're going to implement the credit card provisions that were in the Wall Street Reform Act. And the chairman has met with Visa and with MasterCard. The Fed has met with the big banks. And Senator Durbin and I, who are the principal authors of the credit card reform provisions in the Wall Street Reform Bill, want to meet on behalf of consumers and merchants. And basically, what the Wall Street Reform Bill did with credit cards is try to help our merchants who have been getting hammered with the highest credit card transaction fees in the world. They pay about $50 billion a year in swipe fees. And a lot of folks don't know this, but when you go in and use your credit card, and of course credit cards are really important and they're good in the economy, secure transaction for the merchant, convenience for the consumer. But the charges that the monopoly Visa MasterCard impose are the highest in the world, and it's becoming a huge cost to our merchants, strangling a lot of their viability and profitability. So the legislation does a couple of things. One, it lets a merchant have a $10 minimum. So if somebody's going in to get a cup of coffee, it will end up costing the merchant more. They can say, look, it's a $10 minimum. Secondly, on all debit transactions, it would allow the Fed to establish rates that are reasonable and proportionate. And keep in mind, just for the viewers who aren't as familiar with the credit cards, a debit transaction is just like writing a check. And if I write a check to you or you write a check to me for $100, there's no fee. You get $100, I give you $100. Debit transaction comes right out of your checking account. It's just no paper hassle. So it's actually an easier thing to process. And the fees on those have been escalating, adding to this $50 billion cost. And the regulations are about giving definition to what's reasonable and proportionate. So Senator Durbin and I are having an opportunity to meet with Chairman Bernanke, and we're going to be advocating that this has to be sensitive to the real cost of these transactions.
And this was something that you working on as the Wall Street Reform Act was being discussed, was being debated. And
That's
so
right.
you wanted to make sure it got in there. And
that's right. And, you know, just a little story, go back here. When I was doing these Congress in your communities, which I do at these local country stores, just to meet Vermonters as they're coming and going to work or bringing their kids to school, the merchants came out and they started showing me their credit card statements where they would be paying 2 and 3 and 4% for each transaction in their store. And they had no capacity, any more than you do, on your individual credit card to negotiate terms and conditions. And the United States is really the only country in the world where the credit card transactions have been totally unregulated. When you have a monopoly, which is essentially what Visa and MasterCard are, they act like monopolies do, and they set prices that benefit them and price gouge the consumer, and in this case, the merchant.
And tell us about sort of how these costs have been being passed on to consumers, because you mentioned how these affect businesses, but a lot of the businesses, especially small businesses, say ultimately it hurts the people who are buying goods at my establishment.
Well, it drives up the cost of goods, so that if every time you swipe your fee, you're going to pay in $10, but the merchant has to pay 3%, let's say 30 cents, in order for that transaction to occur. That's added up to $50 billion, incidentally. That obviously is a cost that has to be borne ultimately by the consumer. So if we establish reasonable and proportionate rates, it's going to drive down the price. You know, the merchants face competition. You know, when the banks were lobbying against this, they spent $70 million lobbying against this in the first 6 months of the year. One of their arguments was that if the merchants get a break on the price, then they'll start price gouging, as though the merchants who might be a corner gas station doesn't have to compete with that gas station across the street. And competition is pretty brutal in the retail industry. So the retail competition is keeping prices down for the consumer. But for the monopoly, they're not subject to the law of competition. So they have to have some regulation here to provide fairness to the merchant and ultimately some relief to the consumer.
A separate issue you're also working on is capping credit card rates for consumers at 18%.
Well, you know, it's pretty astonishing. Since credit card interest rates got deregulated, it means that states have no authority to impose what they regard as a reasonable cap on how much interest can be charged. And some credit cards have gone up as high as 41%. And, you know, that would make Tony Soprano blush. So legislation I've introduced along with Maurice Henchy of New York and John Tierney of Massachusetts would cap interest rates at 18%, but give the Fed some latitude in the event that had an economy where interest rates were rising above that. Let's hope that doesn't happen, but we could have some flexibility.
Okay. The at-large congressman for Vermont, Congressman Peter Welch, is our guest. He is a Democrat, and he sits on the Energy and Commerce Committee, Oversight and Government Reform, also Standards of Official Conduct. We're talking a little bit about some of the regulations in the Wall Street Reform Act, also other issues that you're involved with regarding trying to get these credit card rates capped. Why is this issue so important to you? Why are you working on these fiscal issues?
Well, I'll tell you what's important is there's really two business models. You've got your local store, your retailers, your Main Street shops that are under enormous pressure. But the way they cope and survive is by hard work, good service, quality product, fair price. The credit card companies, the banks that had a monopoly, and keep in mind, that's the real distinction here, they take a piece of every transaction as the money is crossing the table. And they're able to, their business model is basically to use the power of their monopoly or duopoly position to extract more and more revenue from folks who are dependent upon the service that is essential for the transaction, the sale of gas, the sale of groceries to occur. And that business model that I think we have to reward is the hard work, the good service, the high quality, the fair price. And our merchants, individual merchants, have no capacity to protect themselves on the cost of each transaction. And when you have electronic transactions that are pretty simple to do, there's an expense involved. The price that's charged has to be fair. And unless you have a cop on the beat, in this case the Federal Reserve, writing regulations that make certain that the banks don't overreach so that the charges are reasonable and proportionate, you're going to see our merchants getting hammered with a cost they can't control, and it eats into their profits, into their viability. So this is, I think, overdue. Other countries have a much lower cost per transaction, and their economies do fine.
Let's get to the calls. Beverly joins us from Phoenix on our Democrats line. Hi there.
Hello.
Good morning.
I have a comment for C-SPAN, and then I have a question for the congressman. You seem to let Republicans go on, and you cut off Democrats immediately. So I wish you'd change your quick hand on the button there.
That's certainly not my intention, Beverly.
The congressman, on the credit cards,
Yes.
they just, they're a big corporate, they're a monopoly, and no matter what rules you pass, you're going to see this come back again with the Republicans when they get in with their big business attitude, and the rules will all change when they're back in power, and it's just a hopeless situation.
Well, Beverly, two things. Number one, Libby's been letting me talk, so I just want to defend her a little bit. But number two, Congressman Bill Schuster of Pennsylvania, Republican, was a co-sponsor with me in my credit card legislation. So I'm actually hopeful that we're going to have a lot of Republicans who want to protect the fairness for their Main Street businesses, have them on board and see that the big banks are really overreaching here. So I'm not ready to give up on some of my Republican friends, and I really thank Congressman Schuster, who was a big part of this. And also, when Senator Durbin proposed his amendment in the Senate, he got, I think, 69 votes in favor of this. So you had a break where several Republicans appreciated this point that I think what Senator Durbin and I are trying to do, and that's get fairness for our Main Street merchants.
We have a question from Twitter. Sasha asks, will the next Federal Reserve be able to change the rules? So things are
well, sure. Rulemaking is an ongoing process, and the point that Beverly made and now Sasha is implying is that things can change, and if there's a change in leadership